It is wonderful to be with you all for the March 2023 CTIPP CAN call. Really look forward to these every time. And we have a really exciting call. So I want to go through a quick policy update before Whitney goes into a much longer policy update and engage discussion throughout the remainder of the call. But March is generally appropriation season for the federal government. This year's appropriate season has been strange, I've been told. I really didn't get into the policy space too much until about 2020 during COVID. And every single year I am told that this year appropriate is acting a little weird, like, legislation is changing. This year is no different. And so don't know what a normal appropriate season really looks like, to be honest with you, from this side of the work, but wanted to share an opportunity to be engaged in appropriations advocacy. I just put a link in the chat. There is a Dear Colleague letter that is sent out by bipartisan members of Congress supporting four main asks in this year's appropriations bill, which is around in new funding for the Interagency Task Force on Trauma-Informed Care, new grants to expand evidence-based trauma support services in schools, increased funding for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and ACEs research at the CDC. And again, this is a bipartisan Dear Colleague letter that is in circulation. And we were asked earlier this week or over the weekend if we could get as many people in our network as possible to ask their members of Congress to sign on to the Dear Colleague letter. So again, I'll put into the chat, because I know that some folks just joined, a link to a blog post that if you click into that, you'll see a highlight that reads sign on to a bipartisan letter. And if you click that, it is an easy access point to be able to easily reach out to your congressional office when you put in your address, asking them to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter. It's a really good opportunity to mobilize appropriations. The president's budget got released much later than usual, and so there is a time crunch that I am aware of. The deadline to send these out is Friday at March 17th. And so if you're able to take the time now to quickly sign on or after the CTIPP CAN call, that would be greatly appreciated. And to the extent that you're able to send this out to others in your network who may be able to do the same, that would also be greatly appreciated. The most groundswell of support that we can get around this appropriations bill would be great. And this is a wonderful opportunity to be able to do that. And so wanted to start off very quickly with that opportunity, but don't want to take too much time. Whitney, I want to turn it over to you to lead the CTIPP CAN call and go over a much broader array of the policy opportunities that exist and the research that you've done. So Whitney, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides here and rearrange things so I can see as many lovely faces as possible while I'm doing that. All right, hopefully you can see my slides. Welcome, advocates, new and those who are seasoned. So good to be with you. Glad to be in community to, as you see on the slide, discuss policy trends from 2022 and take a look at some possible directions for the work, as Jesse just mentioned, moving forward based on the insights and lessons learned. And before we get started, just want to let you know a little bit more about what you can expect. First, Jesse, of course, kicked us off with the quick update on some action that we're encouraging you to take, after which I'll be right now spending some time sharing a bit about the two reports that we want to lift up today. I'll be spending some time sharing some high-level points that have been uplifted in our reports, as well as sort of introduce you to some of the history behind where that comes from. And after that, we are going to invite you to engage in some independent reflection, and then we'll have you convene with others in breakout rooms if you so choose, and then we'll chat in the larger room back in this sort of main space where we're all together about what you talked about, what you learned, and with each of those reflection points, we'll sort of zoom out to a different level of reflection, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And after that, we'll open the floor just in general, if there are any thoughts or wonderments that anyone wants to share, or if anybody just wants to lift up the good work that they're doing in the full group, there will be an opportunity for that as well. And that is really what you can expect for our time together today. And so I am going to go ahead and just advance these slides. All right, so in terms of this report, at the link, Jesse, would you mind, or Laura, would you mind just popping our CTIPP blog link into the chat if you don't mind? And so that will pop up in the chat. I would highly recommend everyone here sort of take a look at that link. You don't need to read the blog right now. I'm going to go over the high level points, but there are a couple of documents that I'm going to be asking you to refer to when we're in groups together. So thank you so much, Jesse and or Laura. I don't have my chat open. I have my slides up. I really appreciate you helping us make sure that people have access to these reports so they know what we're talking about. All right, so again, at the link, you'll see a place to download the report from this place called ITTIC. That's the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, which I'll reference again as ITIC from here on out. And I know there are representatives from ITIC on the team, on the call here today. So I'm so glad to see you all. Thank you for being here. And so just for a bit of context for our folks who are not members of ITIC, as it says on the slide, what ITIC actually does, they're out of the University of Buffalo School of Social Work, and they do this awesome cross-sector work when it comes to supporting folks in learning about, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed change in their organizations, in communities, and in broader systems. And ITIC also does beautiful work publishing important research that is further bolstering the evidence base of what we know works to advance change. And they often create tools and resources to support the people that they work with in doing more of it, more of what works, that is. And so this policy document is one of those tools that was created to support people in doing the on-the-ground work to really keep current with what's unfolding in the political arena, since policy and high-level action at the macro level really does influence the type of work that we can do in communities and on the ground, and it shapes the way we talk about these things and think about these things. And when this was originally created, this policy document, it was significantly less than we are seeing now in terms of this being sort of in people's common discourse that people are talking about across service sectors and systems. And I had the good fortune of working as an ITIC intern while obtaining my own master's in social work. And I really got to watch the growth and evolution of this document from the time I wasn't around when it was created, but I picked it up when I was an intern there. And I know that it had been worked on for several years prior. So this is not my original idea. It's something that came from ITIC, but that I know very well, very intimately from my work over time. And I was tasked to pick up where other interns left off, just because of my interest in policy work, to make updates to this document. Never did I think it would become what it has actually become when I started that project several years ago. And, you know, the document was already impressive at that time because it was exciting, right? To see this showing up at all. It was aligned with the idea of a universal precaution for trauma, right? Where everybody sort of mentally gloves up automatically, so to speak. So even just the fact that these concepts were being discussed in the policy world and really seeing movement and even some policies being signed into law, it really jazzed us, and it jazzed the people who are our champions. And many of them ended up getting involved in policy in their communities and at the state level as well. And even though it's been quite a while since I've been an intern at this point, I still work with ITIC to compile this information and just learn so much about what's happening in the process. And I'm so excited to share some of it with you today, because one of the things that we noticed over time was that as advocates, like all of y'all on this call really pushed the work further and brought about more awareness to the power of prevention and healing through a trauma-informed lens. This document got so big that, and this is no exaggeration, my computer would take minutes at a time with like that MAC rainbow beach ball to save, and it was impossible to navigate because so much was happening. And we were like, what do we do with this? This is exciting, and also what now? And for much of this time, I was really searching each state legislature's website, looking for key terms, just sort of including everything in the broader document, summarizing the parts that I noticed were aligned with the trauma-informed approach, but anything that was even sort of tangentially related made it into the document. And that was really in service of the folks that are our champions doing this work, making change in their systems and organizations, who might want to keep current about this, but not necessarily dig into the full text of trauma-informed legislation if they didn't have to. So in addition to helping to support the growth of that document, simply because of how much was happening, we decided in 2021 to make sort of a year in review report to pull out just that year's active measures, to uplift a few statistics. So really anyone who wanted to get just a general sense of what was happening at the federal and state level would be able to have that at a glance guide. And we did that this year again, which is the report that you see here. Although I really want to emphasize is that, it's definitely a wow to notice even the quantity of proposals that are included. But I would say it's even more impressive to really have monitored the way that the quality and intentionality around integrating trauma-informed approaches has evolved over time in my role of monitoring this. I just noticed tremendous changes in the years that I've been doing this in terms of meaningful inclusion of trauma-informed principles, approaches, and practices. And so that's the process that sort of leads us to this year. In short, with the report on our website on the CTIPP blog link that was included in the chat, and maybe we can just keep popping it in case people are coming in every once in a while, not spamming it, but just making sure everyone has access if they want. We don't include every single bill anymore that has quote unquote trauma informed in it. We don't include every single bill that has quote unquote ACEs in it. If it's something in a 100-page budget bill and it tangentially randomly mentions ACEs in one line, the quality of that is different than some of the really robust measures we're seeing. And so we're like, instead of just dumping all of this information and having people sort through every single iteration of the mention of these types of concepts, let's look at what's meaningful. Let's look at the meaningful integration of the principles and practices of what it really means and looks like to be trauma informed. And so I began expanding the search to really look at concepts and values or principles that are aligned with a trauma-informed approach based on what you see on the slide. This was always my anchor. It was my North Star. These are the SAMHSA frameworks that really guided my work. And so I really focused on including in the 2022 report that you see the measures that I felt most significantly aligned with these principles, these concepts, thinking that, again, it might really help folks move from awareness to action and integration more effectively if they had these sort of shining examples instead of us just sort of accepting the bare minimum and saying, oh, we're happy in 2023 at this point that anybody's mentioning it all. It's a this and, right? Yes, let's celebrate that. And also, we need to do something with these principles. Let's look at where people are really implementing meaningful laws, proposing meaningful measures, and draw inspiration for our action from that. And so as you browse this document, you'll see that the venue is listed in the leftmost column. So whether it's the state, and I don't have this on the slide, but if you just pull up the report from our blog post, you can sort of get a sense of how this is organized. There is the measure number in the next column. It's state or federal in the leftmost column, the measure number in the following column, the status, which in the document that you might be looking at, since it's intended to be an end of year review rather than the broader doc that tracks progress that I kind of create throughout the year as I track these in real time along the way. That status will change often, but most of these will either be something that either became law or something that died at some point in the legislative process process. And that depends, of course, on legislative session dates, but that's most of what you'll see in the year in review document, since most sessions had ended by the time I compiled this information. And even if a measure doesn't get signed into law, and we'll talk certainly about that in a moment, there are so many shining examples that are just so exciting to see the way that people are integrating these concepts and language into change that really could be advanced in future sessions, and that really matters. And the final column is where I place the description of what the general intent or purpose or theme or goals of the legislation is, with descriptions where I notice alignment with trauma-informed approaches highlighted and summarized throughout. So that is my sort of interpretation of these things. That's how I assessed what I felt made sense to include. And I really try to capture the parts that are trauma-informed instead of just being like Command F trauma-informed, like just to search for the term. Really looking through, trying to draw out concepts, make connections. So advocates have something to go by, to really see where these connections are, and to really get a sense of what is actually modeling the model of being trauma-informed within this legislation. And the other thing is that, just checking my notes, it's organized alphabetically, I want to mention. Federal follows the states, and then there are resolutions after the bills. So that is the general organization. And again, always anchoring in what you see on the slide in terms of what's included. And this slide taken from the ITIC report itself captures some of just those high level trends to notice. And again, the analysis, even with that sort of more specific search, still covered 350 legislative proposals, which is just wild to think about. Again, thinking about how it used to be maybe, I don't know, 20 per year. It's just really, really interesting to see the proliferation of this and really exciting. And that's across 44 states in the District of Columbia, along with federal level measures that are included as well. And on this slide is a heat map. So essentially, if you're not familiar with that, and I know the numbers are small, you can see them in the actual report. The darker the shading on a state, the more bills and resolutions that are explored in the report. These are all things that saw movement in 2022. And from there, let's dive into what the CTIPP report really covers. And, that's found on our blog post. You can also download it as a PDF if you so choose. If you want to email it, distribute it, we would love to hear that is happening. And just for some context, the reason for this report, before I start sort of explaining the analysis, is because as I was creating the year in review report for ITIC, I was thinking, wow, there's so much here. It's, again, really overwhelming for me as the person who's literally doing it. What would it be like to even receive this document? How many people would be like, this is cool. And also, I don't even know where to start looking at this. So I'm just going to put this away, store it in my brain that it exists, and never take another look. So I also found myself sort of superficially thinking about the trends that I noticed as I was putting these pieces together, but not really even sure, again, being the person who has read all of these, like about some of the key takeaways. I was like, I'm curious to know. I know I see some themes, but it's really hard to keep track of what seems to be seeing the most movement, what's really happening, because there's just so much of it. And so that was where I thought it seemed like the perfect place for CTIPP to really step in, provide some analysis for people who want to make meaning of this information, who want to take it to the next step, who want to use what's already working and build on it to inform their advocacy efforts. So that's where y'all come in. And let's start by just taking a look at these high-level trends that you see on the slide. When it comes to political parties, that's what this focuses on. So we know that the interconnectedness of the many, many ways that trauma manifests in our broader society covers so many different issue areas, and that mitigating, healing, and preventing trauma is in all of our best interests, regardless of party affiliation. And it's both bipartisan and nonpartisan to support advancing this work. And so as advocates, it's really important for us to notice what already seems to be something where support is actively shown by both parties, where there's already that common ground, people coalescing around shared values and shared goals, And so with bills with bipartisan support on here, we're looking at TI program development, workforce development and training, cross-sector, cross-system collaboration. I'll speak to that a little bit in a moment. These are areas, right, where the two most prominent parties in our government really seem to be agreeing. And then on the right-hand side, you see where they might be diverging, although I will say that there are quite a few commonalities even in those measures, right? So again, program development, workforce, efforts in the pursuit of collaboration. So things like convening communities or working groups or committees or task forces to come up with frameworks that will promote coordination and continuity of those holistic supports. Things like outlining guidelines of how to track data to support coordination and collaboration while also honoring and preserving privacy and confidentiality and avoiding the misuse of the science. Ways for various systems and sectors to come together and work together more effectively, right? Those were among the more prominent themes in measures that had support from both parties. And again, these are the areas that already are getting some support, which means that they can serve as guideposts for us as advocates to really understand, again, those common values, common ground. We might be able to build on this and bolster it further because people are already invested, people are already interested. And you might notice that, again, there's some common ground in the bill sponsored by Dems and Republicans here with trauma-informed program development, right? So specifically getting into planning around how to implement trauma-informed practices in programming, as well as activities and actions that really help create accessible and equitable trauma-informed services and supports to better meet needs. And it's important to notice these themes, right? Because we can see what really seems to matter to folks isn't all that different. And that helps us frame and shape the pitches that we make to our legislators to promote further trauma-informed action. And it also helps us notice where there might be knowledge gaps, right? So for instance, if you notice there's a disproportionate focus, for instance, on addressing trauma among younger people, I'll speak to this a little bit later as well, and yet there might be a less enthusiastic backing to provide support along the life course, or perhaps the legislation really doesn't take into account what we know broader systems and community context, or what we know about those things and the difference that they make in experiences and outcomes along the life course. And what an opportunity, right? To be able to help legislators understand, hey, this thing that you already are caring about, I really want to fill in the gaps for you. I really want to help you expand your support for these principles and the things you've demonstrated that you care about by letting you know the ways that we can impact people at all stages of their lives, to look at the broader community, to look at the systems and how that can further the things that you've already expressed that you really care about and are dedicated to changing. And, so those are the ways that we can look to these clues to inform our own education and advocacy efforts, and find that common ground and also find those opportunities, really trying to stay anchored to in what happened to versus what's wrong with, right? It's very easy to say, how did this person not support this policy? They seem to care about this thing. Well, let's take a step back and think about how we can help meet them where they're actually at and fill in the gaps so they can see the full scope of the things that they care about and what really needs to happen to get to that shared vision of a preferred future that we share. And so in terms of what actually seems to have had the support to more consistently be signed into law, this slide captures some of those key themes with a really significant number of those measures being centered on integrating awareness of trauma sciences into the work, as well as establishing new programming while also enhancing the quality and accessibility of existing ones. Now, there was a notable emphasis as well on the justice system related proposals this year, and under that umbrella, I'd include law enforcement, parole, probation, and reentry professionals, the carceral system, the judicial system, including lawyers and advocates and such. So that's a pretty broad umbrella, but there was a real uptick in that this year. It was a real, and of course that aligns with some of the things we've been hearing about in our sort of common discourse, but just something that I really noted, and it was a pretty high percentage. That's a significant percentage of the items that are included that had some mention, and it could be certainly coordination among other systems working with the justice system. I just thought that was really remarkable that made it to the top of these initiatives in terms of quantity. There was also, again, I want to reemphasize that we know only a small percentage of bills become law, right? So it's really impressive to note that a whopping 28% of the bills that were analyzed in the ITIC report actually did become law. That's 92 new trauma-informed laws made last year. I'm pretty sure that's right. I did the math multiple times. I'm a social worker, so asterisk, but even like that's a lot, right? 92 proposals, 28%. It's higher than the average. We know these matter to people. We see that there's enthusiasm and that they can be successful when they are proposed in a way that really gets stuff done and that really speaks to people's values and what they want to see happen. And that's where your advocacy really comes in, right? And certainly workforce development and training, again, I think aligns with sort of the common discourse. We've been paying more attention to the impacts of the work, both in terms of things like compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, as well as things like vicarious resilience and compassion satisfaction and post-traumatic growth and vicarious post-traumatic growth. So it's just, again, sort of a zoomed out look to get your brains thinking and just noticing what seems to be garnering the most support in a way where not only did this get a lot of movement, but it actually moved past the finish line and is now shaping experiences, outcomes being implemented on the ground across states. And that's really exciting for us to see. And so again, just the last sort of, well, I think it's the second to last, thinking of some general trends noted in CTIPP's report that I think might be worth uplifting is that COVID-19 recovery was interwoven really robustly into a lot of these 2022 measures. And again, that tracks with what we know, right? There's a theme here. What we sort of notice grows bigger. And when we focus on something, it has the more likelihood that it will get more momentum in policy space as well. And so again, really thinking about many of us long on this call, long having recognized that it's important to address trauma at the public policy level as well as on the ground. Yet the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the concurrent events that transpired with racial reckonings and shifts in the economy and how we live and prioritize aspects of our lives and all of that, those events represent a bit of an epic shift, right? Where more and more people have learned about individual and collective trauma and how it can impact our brains and bodies and communities and organizations and systems. And so for those of us who have always sort of known this, it's exciting to see this gaining more momentum, for this to come into the common consciousness and for people to really be talking about this. So, as we bore witness to all that was happening, it became nearly impossible for anyone to really deny that trauma needs to be addressed in a meaningful way. And that shows, again, in the spike of quantity as well as quality when it comes to the meaningful integration of trauma-informed frames, both in proposals directly for that recovery and also more broadly in general. We also note that more than half of the legislative proposals examined had some sort of meaningful reference to the research and the science, whether it's neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience, whether it's trauma and the neurobiology of trauma. It could be any sort of thing that goes under the umbrella of the data, the research, and the information we have in terms of best practices to address what we know are experiences and outcomes when people might have experienced trauma in this legislation. And it really reaffirms that our representatives are paying attention, right, to this growing body of evidence that connects trauma-informed approaches and solutions to addressing some of our society's most challenging and wicked and interconnected issues. This is promising. It's exciting. I'm jazzed about it. I was really thrilled to see more than half. That's pretty striking, right? And again, in this context, this might be a line of the science supporting or defining the trauma-informed provisions that they've outlined as solutions. But it's being integrated. It's being based on the evidence. And we know our evidence base is continually growing in what is a relatively young field in the grand scheme of things. And it's just so exciting to see that momentum And we know that we can encourage those who are already championing this, who already know these things, to really spread the word with their colleagues, right? We have a Dear Colleague letter today that those are effective, right? They have these networks, and these are people they are already in close community with, working with all of the time. We can proliferate that message through those channels, as well as our own on the ground education and advocacy efforts, both with policymakers and decision makers and stakeholders, as well as the people we spend our time in community with in general, just to, again, that universal precaution to raise consciousness around what this looks like. And it really serves to strengthen our argument about what's needed when we pay attention to the inclusion of these concepts at such a high level in the legislation already. We might not need to spend as much time with some legislators sort of describing this science. It's become a little bit more ingrained in the way that they might be thinking about things, or at least people might be more familiar with these concepts. Certainly not all. Your mileage may vary. You want to make sure you're paying attention to your specific decision makers and where they're coming from. But just thinking again, zooming out at a global scale, there's precious time that we spend with legislators, right? We don't have very long to make those pitches. So if we don't need to say, here's what trauma is, here are the impacts that we know to be true in a broad sense, and we want to get more granular to advance our specific advocacy goals, this gives us the opportunity to not just educate at a high level, but to deepen legislators' education and really make a strong case for the transformation that we want to see. We can skip over some of the basics for some folks, and some folks still need to have that sort of primer, right? Still is, it's more than half, and also it's still not quite everybody. And so just again, really thinking about contextualizing what you notice broadly to your specific area will be something we'll be talking about in our discussions today. So hang tight on that. One area to inform advocacy moving forward that I really noticed throughout compiling these was that despite the emphasis and acknowledgement on the science, the majority of legislation really still does center children's experiences without fully operationalizing what we know about the science to attend to the impacts of trauma and adversity for those who have already emerged into adulthood, or failing to recognize the potential to disrupt intergenerational patterns through supporting caregivers, creating family supports, improving community contexts, enhancing healthy social connections, keeping systems talking to one another, helping people get their needs met no matter what their experiences have been, right? And so just those other considerations regarding the science that maybe they have this sort of primer on, but need a little bit more education around, what an opportunity, right? For us to help folks who already are on board with supporting children right now to see the potential to disrupting the legacy of trauma for children yet to be born, as well as the power of just supporting all human beings at all stages of their life and in various situational contexts. I think I spoke to this a little bit before, but it's becoming clearer in the legislation that folks are seeing the importance of collaboration and coordination, again, across all sectors and systems to truly reduce re-traumatization. One of the things that, of course, those of us who sort of wake up thinking about this have been talking about and advocating for a while, but hasn't necessarily been represented as much in the legislation, has really taken a shift. And that's exciting to see, right? I'm noticing more emphasis, not just on this being sort of a quote unquote, I guess, mental health challenge that you address retroactively through evidence-based interventions funded through policy, but instead the legislation has really broadened to support more holistic and collaborative ways of addressing trauma with recognition for how it can touch our spiritual, physical, emotional, economic, environmental, and social well-being, both individually and collectively. Another thing I noticed in compiling this report was that there were more measures than previous years connecting trauma-informed concepts to ABDEIJ concepts, which include accessibility, belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And this aligns, right? The cultural, historical, and gender issues value of a trauma-informed approach, as outlined by SAMHSA, really shines a spotlight on the often intersectional disproportionalities and disparities that exist in experiences, impacts, and outcome based upon identity factors based on the status quo. And so this principle is being enlivened, again, the cultural, historical, and gender issues principle, more frequently and in more meaningful ways in these proposals than I have ever seen before in the time that I've been making this document. So that's really encouraging to see. One note for an area, again, rich with opportunities to build on what's already working would be to direct attention and energy to really continuing to expand the evidence base. As I was speaking to earlier, right, we're continuing to work on this. It's still a relatively young field. We've been working for a while and we're finding out more every single day. And that means really that it calls on those of us who are in the field to implement research, share out successes like we do sometimes here, create templates for best and promising practices that policymakers then can integrate into legislation to support faithful and meaningful implementation of trauma-informed principles and practices. Also airs some legitimacy to the work that we're doing, the more that evidence base is bolstered. And it's also really helpful for key decision makers and stakeholders to know how they can carry forward the work because they have these sort of shining examples to look to. And then they can work to translate it and collaborate, hopefully with advocates and people in the community with lived experience to the unique constellations and of needs that have emerged in their states and communities. And finally, some of the barriers inferred by really taking a look at the veto memos are listed here. There were a few proposals that did make it through the legislature, and then the governor decided to veto them. And I would say far and away, I think this will not be a surprise to anyone who's been doing this work, the most common reason for a governor vetoing a bill that did pass in the legislature is finances and budgetary constraints. And so I know it sometimes can feel icky. It sometimes can feel like, you know, it's not the focus that we want to be focusing on. And also it's clearly important that we help legislators and key decision makers understand the value in investing upstream to prevent future harm, and use the best data that we can in order to illuminate the cost savings, not just in terms of financial money, but also in terms of human capital and the ways that people participate in the workforce and in their families, and how we are able to show up in our community life and participate in broader society. So the price tags on our vision of a preferred future don't need to halt the action. This is just another area where we can really be advocates to help people understand the reality and the power of prevention through this lens. Then the last slide I just want to share again for the high level overview. I know you're going right into discussions and you're not going to have a ton of time to really take a look at this long couple of reports, is just a sort of at a glance look where I took some time to connect the policies in the report to the dimensions that we at CTIPP have set forth in our comprehensive vision for a more trauma-informed society. And you can see here that the most common dimension tapped in this framework from CTIPP is to improve quality and accessibility of services. 64% of policies, so again, significantly, actually pretty significantly more than half, that we analyzed had some sort of connection to this. And so you can see the numbers. And I also want to mention that the report has some legislative summaries for each dimension to sort of give you an idea of what a bill that touches on these dimensions that we've created might look like. I want to sort of say while we're together, those policies were not necessarily selected because we think they are shining perfect examples of the most wonderfully aligned policies based on what we want to see happen in each dimension. But really they're meant to say, hey, here's a real world example. And I tried to make sure that there's like from all over the country, regardless of party affiliation. So I tried to keep it balanced in terms of looking not just, at one state that's really strong, but sort of taking and picking and choosing from different places, different parties, different ideas that I just considered notable as some examples to lift up and inspire you. So again, there are examples of legislation touching on parts of the policy dimensions listed here. We sort of sparked our thinking in our team meetings, like maybe we could make some eventually as we continue to do these analyses to think about what might be a really strong example specifically for each dimension. So TBD on that, but for now, these are examples of real policies in 2022 that hit on those comprehensive vision dimensions. And of course, many of these are interconnected, so there's overlap, and that's why it's not 100%, right? It's how many of the proposals examined included something that was aligned with this dimension. All right, so a lot of information that I threw at you for sure. First, I'd invite you to just access the worksheet. If we can pop my wonderful team of Jesse and Laura, if you don't mind popping into the chat so it's accessible, that link one more time. I would invite everybody to go ahead, pull up that blog post under the link labeled reflections and discussion questions. You'll find a document that you can download. If you do not have Microsoft Office, you can open it in Apple Pages, which comes free on Mac computers. You also can save it and open it in Google Docs if you have a Google account. So you'll be able to open this on those programs. And we're inviting you first to do some independent reflection as you take some time with the report and really just flip through with consideration for the prompts and anything else that strikes you or grabs your attention. And it's hopefully pretty straightforward. It's around 6 questions. And of course, you do not have to hand these in or anything. We do hope it's a helpful anchor for your reflection. And let's take maybe 15 minutes for self-reflection, just taking a look independently. It's okay if you don't get to everything. It's okay if all you do is flip through. Again, these are guideposts to help you think about these things. And then we're going to put you into breakout rooms to chat with each other. And you can use your time however it feels useful to you in there as well. And so I'd invite you to go ahead. Let's 2:55 p.m. Eastern time will be the time that we will be done with independent reflection time. I'll build the breakout rooms in the meantime. And I'll also play some music so it isn't weirdly quiet in here. If you want to be off camera, that's fine too. I know it sometimes can be awkward sitting on camera. And so we'll give you that independent time. We'll check back in and then we'll put you in breakout groups. Thanks, Laura. Wow, right on cue. Really good timing. All right, everybody. Before we move into our breakout groups, I know we've been together and silent for a while. So if you'd like to join in on a brief group exercise to quickly get attuned to ourselves so we can be present to one another, I'd invite you to do so if you'd like. And I would invite you to start by getting in a position that feels safe and comfortable to you and where you're able to cross your hands across your body and give yourself a great big hug. And as you're noticing the warmth of your hands on your body in that self-hug, noticing through your senses how you feel, I would invite you to just take a brief moment to focus on your thoughts, on something or someone that you're grateful for. Just sort of bring that to mind and begin to notice. And breathe in slowly through your nose with me for a count of 4, 2, 3, 4, and hold it. 2, 3, 4, and release it. 3, 4, and now hold there. 2, 3, 4. Let's do one more breath in. Hold it. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. And hold that. 2, 3, 4. Beautiful. And now I'd invite you to just release this brief practice and bring your awareness back to our shared space. While we quickly go through these community agreements that each of us participating in the breakout discussions today will be expected to uphold, we're going to do 15 and 15. So 15 minutes in breakouts, 15 minutes in the big group before we send y'all away for the rest of your day. And briefly, these are that everyone is in charge of their own disclosure in terms of whether and what and how much they share. You know, we're asking for you to engage with intention in order to maintain mutually respectful environments. We each will hold ourselves accountable to remaining in that what happens stance rather than jumping to what's wrong with, right? So we'll engage in compassion and curiosity, and we'll ask questions rather than making assumptions. We'll call people in rather than calling people out. We would ask that you please commit to being attentive to the language that you use, as well as how much time and space you claim in your breakout room, recognizing that time is an equity issue and different folks may process and wish to share different things at a different pace. We each will commit to ensuring that we speak from our own experience rather than making generalizations. We'll engage in a universal precaution for trauma ourselves, making sure that we're communicating in a trauma-informed way to support safety and empowerment and trust, including being sure to advise everyone if any sensitive content that could potentially be activating comes up in your conversation. And finally, it's important that each of us engages in ongoing self-reflection to ensure that we ourselves are doing what we need to stay regulated, including taking care of ourselves in this conversation. Pat, I really appreciate it. Yeah, feel free to take and use whatever you'd like to do. Is there anything that isn't up here that anyone wants to see integrated in order to facilitate your participation in this discussions? Is anything missing? Awesome. All right, so we've got 4 breakout groups. Would love to hear from everybody. Feel free to use the guided prompts if you'd like. You do not have to if you have something else that you want to chat about. This is about your experience and sharing wisdom and lessons learned and insights. And whatever happens in these rooms, we assume is what's supposed to happen. And you create that together, you co-create that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open your rooms. Let's talk in the big space after we're done. I'm looking forward to seeing you back and have great conversations in the meantime. Welcome back, everybody.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh boy. Welcome back. All right. And as mentioned before, thank you so much for being in community with one another, holding yourselves accountable to our community agreements that we set forth together. Curious to know any takeaways. Anyone can begin the broader discussion, anything that struck you, no structure, just what you want to share, common themes. Carrie, I see you unmuted. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we had a great group, Melaine, Kat, Deb, Antonio, and if I forgot somebody, and Melanie. And we started out, really praising the report, our deep gratitude to you for bird dogging this and being so astute. And so yay that. And then we went into talking about handle with care and wondered whether or not handle with care was represented in what you had reported, because we know that there are many states now, I think 40 some odd states that have got some type of handle with care initiative either up and going. And for those who don't know, handle with care is a cross-sector initiative that combines education and law enforcement, so that if a child has a visit from law enforcement in the night, the next morning at school, the school gets a fax or an email that says the child's name, handled with care, so the child is not re-traumatized during the day. So we talked about that, and then we shifted into a trend that Melaine has really experienced, having just come back from some consulting in Arizona, and that my coworker Matthew Portell and Jesse and I had talked about the blowback from all of this of the right wing really attacking social emotional learning, anything that's got that or critical race theory, any of that lingo. So how do we protect ourselves and this work so that it doesn't get sacrificed, crucified, the woke,
And I think I want to add on that when coming back, thank you for that introduction from Arizona. I mentioned the state's superintendent has created a hotline where if parents find something objectionable or uncomfortable on SEL, they can report the teacher on this hotline for further investigation. And so what this has created is a trauma platform for teachers. Arizona is already working with a very high vulnerable population. Teen pregnancy is high, migrant populations are coming in. Clearly, we know that there's been political platforms and hatred speech, as you well know, that's been well documented in Arizona. And excuse my appearance, y'all. recovering from COVID. So that's why I'm looking like this. I just think that SEL is going to be a platform that we're collectively going to have to continue to support in our trauma-informed initiatives as politicians try to garner media attention at the risk of children's mental health.
So I want to comment on your tip line. Virginia probably led that with the January tip line by our governor. And I don't know how many tips were done. We had groups who overwhelmed it with compliments about teachers.
Brilliant.
Yeah, but the tip line is gone now. There was a lawsuit to make it, available, and it just kind of just disappeared. So hopefully you'll see the same. But I just love the positive things people send in.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
I'll start spreading the word when I'm back in the fall.
Yeah, it would be good to do a post on that. That's a great social media post when the West Virginia, whatever it was, tip line was overwhelmed, It was instead inundated with great news about teachers. But of course, everything that we do can attract blowback. So we need to be careful how we do what we do so that it's not inflammatory and we don't contribute to evoking more trauma. It's going to be
Good point.
It's sticky wicket. I bet Dave Ellis might have something to say about that.
Nothing like throwing me under the bus there, Carrie.
No, I'm just exalting your wisdom and lived experience and your tact and diplomacy and
Yeah, when you bring up those topics, I have no tact and diplomacy. I become the person who just kind of confronts it head on. I've been living this for so damn long that I can't not respond. Right? It's innate now that when I hear people have this conversation about CRT and woke and all these other fun things that folks like to get excited about, I keep asking them, where do you see this? Help me understand where you see this, because CRT isn't taught anywhere except in college. That is the only place it's taught, and there's no place in the country where it's in a high school or an elementary school. I mean, it's understanding and knowing all the facts around all this fun stuff, but I've taken the Angela Davis approach to this. Angela Davis said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. I've just gotten fed up with it. Okay. So I'm enjoying myself out here in Mesa, Arizona, and I am absolutely looking forward to figuring out what's the next step here. Because you're right. Tom Horn's a nut.
He's a nut. Thank you. Thank you for saying my words.
Yeah, those are the nice ones.
He's an old white man that's past his time, that's looking for political stage. He probably wants to be DeSantis's running mate. And so he's starting this conversation.
This is a guy who was kicked out of being the superintendent before and somehow got reelected. So
as the superintendent?
Yeah, he's the overall of the education. I don't know. I forget what the title is.
Probably superintendent. So our governor, Youngkin, is politically looking for lots of, appointed someone who came in and made lots of changes in our Department of Ed. That superintendent resigned a couple weeks ago, which is pretty interesting. They tried to put through transgender policies that were really almost polar opposite of what had been put into place the prior year. There were something like 70,000 public comments. And so we haven't heard anything since that overwhelming number of public comments. They're trying now to revise the history standards of learning, which were revised during a 2-year process that had 900 people collaborating, experts. They the new administration rewrote it, and it's full of omissions and errors, but they're trying to pass that through. So yeah, it's really challenging when we talk about prevention. That to me, that's part of prevention. We don't put out things that are discriminating against particular kids, or that are omitting and distorting history. But it's so challenging.
Important conversation. Thanks for lifting that up, y'all. And yeah, we see that this is proliferating across different states, being able to sort of coalesce around these common values and goals and talk about what's happening and what we think needs to, what the steps that need to be taken to mitigate this from spreading further. So important. Thanks for bringing that up. Thanks, Carrie, for reporting out on your room. And I see, Max, you've got a hand up. I would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry I had to step out for another meeting for a little while, but I'm excited these are recorded, right? So you can go back and check. Yeah, I did want to it was important to me to also come in here and step in. And on the topic, I missed earlier conversation, so apologies to shift of gears a little bit. But to the initial conversation on this month's meeting, which is about federal and state level dollars, one thing I wanted to report out on was about how inequity doesn't end just because we got the dollars sometimes and really getting it over the finish line. I have so many examples, and as people know, I come from kind of the lived experience, peer community, the actual service users that these dollars are ultimately meant to help. And I have so many examples of, even when you get the quote trauma-informed program in place, it's still being exclusionary and not living up in principle. On the name, it's slapped up there. And in very concrete specific examples, this month, I talked to UC Davis, has a program where they acknowledge that there is ableism in design of autism services. And they got $200,000. And what they're spending that $200,000 on is doing yet another user survey of inaccess to care, and why don't we bring more peers in, and then developing a toolkit to help researchers work with the autistic. I know of 12 toolkits that already exist and over a dozen reports. It is just absolutely laughable to me that money is getting spent in that way. And one reason it's getting spent that way is no one in my community got to write that grant. And UC Davis has a team of trained grant writers and my community doesn't. So as we fight for these dollars, as important, and it's really impressive work. That report's fantastic. It's incredibly useful on one level. On the other level, so many of my community, that report is useless because they just don't have the capacity to go. There's so many committees that they won't get invited to. There are so many grant programs that they don't have grant fund writers that they can go apply for. And I just wanted to, I know we're kind of right at time, so I'm trying to condense this, but I want to see that as part of this conversation as well. That the advocacy doesn't end at getting the dollars and the programs.
Thank you so much, Max. Such important points, right? What next? How do we make sure that these are being implemented in a way that really will make the change that we want to see happen? And how do we engage people more meaningfully than just continuing to create this endless streams of reports that go nowhere? Much work to be done, and I appreciate you uplifting that. And as we're entering our last minute, is there anything I want to uplift again, the Dear Colleague letter that we're passing around, signed by Friday. We know it's short notice. Just want to remind your brains about that piece. Before we close out, any final comments? Beth, I see you unmuted. Anything you want to lift up before we part ways?
No, I just forgot to mute, but thank you.
I mean, 2023 Zoom life, here we are. Anything anyone's working on that they're really proud of that they want to share out, or again, any conversation points from today you want to lift up before we part ways?
The Center for Educational Improvement is working with NIEA on listening tours. I just want to promote that. Dr. Mason's work, Jesse's familiar. He has also participated in the Center for Educational Improvement's business and their network with Yale University and their work. So if you get a chance, check out our website and see what the Native community is doing systemically on getting Native youth voices out and how we can improve the situation for all Indigenous people.
Thanks for lifting that up.
Certainly necessary.
Carrie, you have something you want to take us out with?
Long overdue. Just, you know, Cases Connection continues its wonderful partnership with CTIPP, because we love you guys and all that you do and love to lift it up. And I'll get the letter posted on Cases Connection and out ASAP. And just, you know, I'm reminded of the Dark Ages, right? And there was a group of nuns led by a woman named Hildegard of Bingen, who they lived in a cave, I'm told, and they just kept praying. And not that I, you know, but that just focusing on the things that were good that were happening and saying over and over and over again, all is well, and all manner of things, all is well. So, you know, they took a strength-based approach in the Dark Ages, and they were credited with helping, you know, keep some light on in the time of pits, and that, you know, out of the Dark Ages, some great things arise. So maybe we're in a type of dark age culturally, and we're about to crack this nut, I hope.
Ooh,
So
powerful. Something to sit with for sure.
Yeah, I think we're all warriors. Thank you for saying that. Strength-based, positivity, trauma-informed, data, near science, collective bargaining, empowering educators, where all marginalized people have a platform where they can speak their truth for social justice. That's my heart.
Couldn't put it better.